This is a really interesting question. There's a lot of growing research on this. Addiction is pretty much a worldwide problem that manifests in different ways, and it's actually really a biopsychosocial problem. Part of it's genetics, part of it's the environment people grow up in, and part of it's what people are exposed to in terms of causes. That being said, without having to go on and on about my interest in biopsychosocial models, there's a lot of really good evidence for where mindfulness can be particularly helpful around addiction. One of the things I think that a lot of us are also seeing, or again, those of us who are therapists are seeing, and maybe those of us in our personal lives are seeing, people around us really struggling with substances, particularly during the shutdown, the lockdown, the shelter-in-place order, whatever we might be calling it in different parts of the world. A lot of substance abuse with coping. Mindfulness. Let me just say one thing about that, which is that one of the things that's really impressed me as a mental health provider, as well as someone who has a real interest in addiction in particular, is that things like 12-step meetings, Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, these are all online. These are all on Zoom now. If you're in Singapore, you could actually probably join a meeting in New York or wherever in the world you wanted to. So that's actually really a wonderful thing for this particular situation we're in. As far as where mindfulness fits in terms of addiction, Alan Marlott wrote a wonderful book and developed a program called MBRP, Mindfulness-Based Relapse Prevention. It's been pretty well tested and validated at this point. Unfortunately, he died just a few years after the book was published, so he didn't have a big chance to kind of get the movement going. But it's a really useful program. It's an 8-week program based on mindfulness-based stress reduction, and it also integrates really interesting practices. There's a couple that I'm trying to think of. There's something called the sober breath, which is like stop, observe what you're thinking. Oh my gosh, I can't remember what the whole acronym stands for, but it's a useful one. The other one that's really useful, he developed a practice called urge surfing, like a surfboard, urge surfing. And what it does is it helps people, you kind of ask someone to bring up a craving that they're having. And you don't often start with someone's drug of choice. Maybe you start with like chocolate cake or something like that, maybe that we're craving. And then you help them locate it in their body. And then notice that craving, feel the sensations of the craving, watching it rise, pass, move around a little bit, breathe their way through it, and eventually notice that the craving, the urge, actually eventually passes. Now, this is really important because we can tell people who are struggling with addiction, your craving will pass. And if that worked to tell them their craving will pass, well, then I'd be out of a job and it'd be really easy for anyone to recover from alcoholism or from addiction. People need to know that themselves, need to experience that themselves. So it's really kind of a simulation through mindfulness of watching that urge rise, watching it pass. People believe it with chocolate cake, then they can start to believe it with alcohol or whatever their drug might be. Although I know Singapore is very strict about drugs, which is different than where we are in the States, where more and more things are legal in terms of different kinds of substances. Another practice that I think is very interesting that I think might come out of dialectical behavioral therapy, which is another form of therapy. Some friends of mine at one of the local hospitals taught me this in terms of addiction work and also in terms of self-harm. We have a lot of teenagers who are cutting themselves and doing self-harm. It's a big thing here in recent years. What therapists will say, and of course I'd recommend this if you're a therapist, not if you're just anybody. Yeah, I'll get an email address to get this slide. Is, okay, you know that you're going to drink on Friday night. That's what you do every Friday night. You go out with everybody after work. So go drink whether I tell you to or not, but don't drink right away. Take 5 minutes before you drink and come back, and then notice what happens in that 5 minutes and come back and then order your drink and do whatever you do about it. And it becomes a really interesting conversation about what happens in that space, which essentially there's this, in English, there's often this mindfulness kind of quote by Viktor Frankl, that's actually not really by Viktor Frankl, between stimulus and response, there's a space, and that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom, right? And so mindfulness to space between stimulus and response, between feeling angry and wanting to have the drink and taking the drink, right? And how do we expand that space? So the other ways that mindfulness also operates, we see Sarah Lazar, who I know was over there last year, a lot of her research focused on which parts of the brain start to change when we practice mindfulness in terms of neuroplasticity. The prefrontal cortex up here, off when we're stressed out, right? That's an impulse control part of the brain. So with mindfulness, we have greater impulse control, but it also, then that part of the brain starts to grow new connections. So again, these are ways that mindfulness can be helpful. The other little acronym that actually I was going to get to it in the next segment, but I ran out of time, but kind of goes along the biopsychosocial. There's a great acronym in addiction work, HALT, H-A-L-T. Actually, I can pull up the slide if I can find it. It stands for don't let yourself get too hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. It's used in addiction and other impulse control kind of work, because when we're hungry, our impulse control goes down. When we're angry or anxious, our impulse control goes down. Our prefrontal cortex stops working. When we're lonely, we're less likely to make good decisions. When we're tired, we lose a lot of our impulse control and our self-control. These things start to fall apart. So this is a really kind of useful mindful check-in, is how I've started to adopt this. Check in with yourself. Are you feeling hungry? Yes or no? What could you do about it? Are you feeling emotional, angry, or anxious? Could you take a few breaths? Could you listen to sounds? Feel your feet on the ground, do something relaxing. Are you feeling lonely? Can you reach out, right? Which is, again, in this isolation time, also really important. Are you feeling tired? Not a lot we can do about feeling tired, except maybe having some more coffee, right? But trying to get some rest when we can, or at least being aware of the fact that we're tired. Because as we name our emotional experience, right, then it actually becomes less of an intense emotional experience just by naming it. That happens in the brain and MRI machines. It's not just something that we say to little kids. That was a very long answer to your question.
And you have about 8 more questions, so we're going to have to get you to be more brief. There's also a book by Dr. Judson Brewer at the Brown University.
Oh, yeah.
For those of you interested, it's called The Craving Mind. Okay, next question is, sometimes when I concentrate on my breath, I realize that I've stopped breathing and I panic. Is that abnormal?
That's actually very normal. A lot of people find this is something that happens for them. Some people, this is why when I opened with that initial practice, I suggested you can focus on your breath if you want to. You can focus on sounds if you want to focus on sounds, or maybe you want to focus on your body. And in particular, you might notice that the prompt I gave you was to focus on the edges of your body, like your feet on the ground, or your legs on the chair, or your back on the chair. Some people, when they start with the breath, they get a lot more anxious. And so you might want to start with anchoring your attention on, the edges of your body where it makes contact with the seat, or even sounds around you, sounds at a distance, sounds closer in. That's actually my favorite way of practicing, is listening to sounds. Addiction applies to gaming addiction. Yeah, I'd say probably, yeah.
Thank you. Next question is, how long does it take to reach a calm state in daily life that you mentioned?
I think it depends a lot on the person. So for some people, the more we practice something like mindfulness or anything that calms us down, because a lot of things calm us down, not just mindfulness, the more we practice anything, then what we're really doing in our brains, I talked about this idea of neuroplasticity, which is that the neurons that fire together wire together, basically. We build these new shortcuts and new connections in our brain. And so the more we practice calming down, the easier it becomes to then calm down quickly. We still actually, with mindfulness, with anything we do, we end up getting upset, but we can calm ourselves down a lot more quickly than people who don't practice calming down. They can calm themselves down. It takes a lot longer. So I would just recommend practicing, these little things like the calm reminder, or that 3 R's practice, or some of these other things, just at different points in your day, so that you're just always bringing your level of anxiety and stress down a little bit, or the 7-11 breath, or things like that. Yeah.
Thank you. Does practicing mindfulness make one more susceptible to hypnotism or other forms of mental subconscious influences?
I don't know exactly the research on that. There's a lot of blurry lines between hypnosis and mindfulness and the relaxation response, concentration practices, concentration meditation, mindfulness meditation, guided imagery, visualization. Um, I think it would really depend on who you asked, because a lot of people would say these are very, very different things. But those are also a lot of people who have a stake in their thing being what they're researching or something like that. So I just want to give a word of caution about that. The best kind of differentiator that I think I've heard, John Kabat-Zinn, who's really well known as a mindfulness teacher, talks about mindfulness is really falling awake. It's becoming more aware, not less aware. There are some practices, which hypnosis actually makes us kind of less aware in terms of our senses. There are some practices that help us practice mindfulness and visualizations that can, often people do tend to get a little bit sleepy, or they tend to be in a little bit more of like a hypnagogic state or something like that. But I think most mindfulness practices are trying to create a heightened sense of awareness, rather than kind of having that more soporific, sleepy effect that hypnosis does. I do, I, yeah, I think it really depends a lot on how each person is exactly defining mindfulness. But there's a lot of similarities. There's definitely a lot of similarities in what's happening in the body, but there are differences in what's happening in the brain. In fact, if you put people in an MRI machine and you hypnotize them, you see different parts of the brain activated and deactivated than if you put people in an MRI machine and you have them do mindfulness meditation, which is actually different than if you put them in an MRI machine, have them do guided imagery, or have them do hypnosis, or have them do concentration meditation, or like a loving kindness meditation.
Thank you. How do you manage when companies are announcing job cuts and salary cuts? In other words, related to anxiety, which your next talk is going to be focusing on. But if you'd like to give a short answer for now, till then.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think that this is, a really hard time, because part of, what anxiety is it's our mind kind of coming up with horror stories that are not necessarily true. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where there's a lot of really bad things that are happening and scary things that are happening that are true, like, pay cuts and job layoffs and things like that. And I think it's important that we both be with the pain and discomfort and sadness of all of that, as well as that we practice self-care, self-compassion, and mindfulness, so that we can, bring ourselves through the other side without becoming depressed, without turning toward alcohol, without turning toward, even more anxiety or something like that, and help ourselves move forward with getting a new job or adjusting to whatever these really significant changes are in our lives. And we can just see things that much more clearly. That's where I feel like mindfulness can be really helpful. And to have some, I hesitate to say acceptance, although I would say acceptance of what the situation is. But it can be kind of a challenging word, I think. But equanimity with what's going on in the situation.
Thank you. Next question is, could you talk more about mindfulness in the social domain, given that face-to-face contact is taken out of lives now?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think is wonderful I mean, look at this, there's 200 of us from around the world right now logged in and connecting with each other. Finding, those of you that are in Singapore, like continuing to seek out programs through the Brahm Center. It sounds like they're offering still online courses, online gatherings. I cannot believe how much I mean, I'm very plugged into the meditation and mindfulness world. Obviously, it's my job, but it's going on in North America and in Europe as well, with whether it's really small communities or even much larger communities of people getting together and really maintaining their relationships and social relationships through mindfulness. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity here. And an opportunity for people like, again, it's hard depending on your household makeup. If you've got kids, it's really hard to start a meditation practice right now. But, if you don't, for example, it might be a chance to start practicing yourself or with a partner, or meeting some other people online. Or if you do have kids, to think about ways to bring this into the family in some different ways.
Thank you. And it'd be worth noting that today in the afternoon, there's a mindfulness-based stress reduction course starting at 2 o'clock. So if you'd like to
Nice.
register for that. Okay. Another question here is, how do we help a friend who's extremely negative and becoming sarcastic during this difficult time?
This is really, really hard. I mean, I think it's a challenging time because obviously when someone's being so negative, to me, that's really a cry for help, that they need a lot more support. I think trying to maintain some degree of positivity, and also, figuring out for ourselves, like, how much do we want to support that person and how much do we also need to be maybe taking a bit of a break from that person right now to maintain our own sanity and balance. I this is in my kind of later sort of mindfulness and social part of the talk that I didn't get to, but just thinking about social media even, and um, I noticed there's a lot of just misinformation in some of my social media, and a lot of people that are just being really negative. And I just, my Facebook, I just like snoozed a lot of people for a month because I didn't want to be around that level of negativity. Or if I didn't want it to just be in my face, I could go and seek it out and reach out to those people, some of whom I did, but I blocked having to see their constant negativity, sarcasm, and misinformation, and actually found it really helpful. So now when I was logging into Facebook, it was much more of a positive place than a really kind of frustrating and negative place for me. So that's something that I actually chose to do. But some of those people that are, I also know that are being really sarcastic and negative, that's coming from a place of real suffering in them and thinking about how they need support. And so thinking about how to reach out to them in some other ways, rather than on like a social media argument or something like that.
Thank you. Perhaps the last question is going to be, it's getting late for you. And if you have
Very
any
hard
more,
at the negative yes, yeah.
okay. Children can get anxious or angry very suddenly. How do I bring them to become mindful to calm them down in a very short period of time?
Well, there's no short answer for that, and there's no kind of short, quick fix for kids who are dysregulated. The best thing that we can do for our kids is to be as present as possible and to be as well regulated as possible for ourselves, managing our own stress. And again, I know that it's always difficult, even in non-COVID times, to not be stressed out. But particularly in this time, our kids pick up so much of our own stress. So the more that we can really try to take time out to give them our complete attention when we can. And when we can't, to really let them know that we can't do that right now. Like, I can give you my complete attention in 10 minutes, but I can't do it right now. That can really be helpful for them. So the more we're able to regulate ourselves, the more that's going to be helpful to our kids. That being said, I think also just other basics like, making sure that the kids are getting some exercise, making sure that they're getting a chance to, be in touch with extended family, have their grandparents read to them over Skype and Zoom and FaceTime, see their classmates online when they can, be doing all the things that usually help them with their stress and anxiety, are going to be really important to making sure that they get the sleep that they need. Different parts of the world are very different in terms of schooling. I know in the States, a lot of, depending on the school, like some kids don't start school till later in the day, so they're sleeping through their classes now. And I know other parts of the world are much more strict about all the kids have to be logged in and online at 8 a.m. But sleep is going to help kids with that kind of thing a lot. But I wish there was a magic bullet. There's not. The best thing you can do when your kid is having a hard time is to try to keep yourself calm and know that your kid, so that your kid knows that you're there for them when they are able to feel calm again, that you're ready to connect back with them, build that connection, reconnect. And that will really, really, really help them feel safe and secure through this time. To know that you're right there on the other side of their difficult moment, their meltdown, their tantrum, their anxiety. That's what's going to be really important for them. But it's going to be a hard time for them and for all of us. Yeah, it's tough. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Any last words before we end the session today?
Well, that's about it for me. And hopefully I'll see folks again, maybe in a couple of weeks, and we can figure out what that program will be. And thank you again for showing up for yourself. And thanks for showing up also for the people around you who will probably really benefit from you practicing mindfulness, learning how to manage your stress a little bit more effectively. So thank you.
Thank you again, Chris. And I look forward to meeting all of the rest of you as well at the Mindfulness at Sunset sessions that we're holding every day during the weekdays from 6 to 6:30 p.m. And Chris will be back. He will be back on Zoom with us on the 1st of May on Labor Day. So check the links that we'll be publishing very soon, and we'll have him back online. Thank you once again, Chris. And thank you everyone
Thank
for
you
joining us this
so
morning.
much. Take
Bye.
care. Bye-bye.